The first rule of submarine warfare was never meant to be heroic. It was meant to keep men alive. In the long, dark world beneath the waves, every submariner knew that rule by heart. You do not fight a destroyer. A submarine is supposed to be a ghost, a shadow, slipping silently through the deep, stalking, lumbering cargo ships and fat tankers that feed an enemy war machine. The destroyer is something else entirely. The destroyer is the wolf. It is fast, it is lethal, and it exists for one purpose, only to hunt the hunter and tear it apart. Before we dive into this story, if you love these forgotten tales of courage, strategy, and sheer audacity from the Second World War, you are warmly invited to subscribe to Untold Battles. Your support helps keep these stories alive and encourages us to bring you even more of the battles, patrols, and decisions that changed history but rarely make it into the textbooks. Now let us go beneath the surface. For most American submariners in the Pacific, the appearance of a Japanese destroyer was not an opportunity, it was a death sentence. From December of 1941 through the early spring of 1944, Japanese destroyers sent 14 American submarines to the bottom in combat. In that same period, not a single Japanese destroyer had been sunk by an American submarine in a straight-up fight, while both were actively hunting each other. The arithmetic was simple and unforgiving. On the surface, a destroyer could sprint at roughly 35 knots. A submerged submarine running on batteries alone struggled to reach even 9. The destroyer had sonar sets that could reach out and feel the ocean around it, and racks of depth charges that turned seawater into a sledgehammer. The submarine, once it dove, was blind and nearly deaf, trying to stay absolutely silent, while men listened for the faintest ping through the hull and prayed it was moving away, not toward them. Doctrine was crystal clear. If a destroyer found you, you dove. You went deep-rigged for silent running, shut down every non-essential sound, and you waited while men gripped bulkheads and listened to the sea explode. That was the way things were done. In 1944, one quiet, bespectacled commander decided that the rules had been written by men who were thinking like prey, not like hunters. His name was Samuel de United States Navy. He was 37 years old, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1930. On the surface, he seemed reserved, almost understated. He wore spectacles. He was not the picture of a swashbuckling pirate captain, but under that calm exterior was a spine of hardened steel forged under fire as the executive officer of one of the most infamous submarines in the Pacific, the USS Wahoo under Commander William Mush Morton. From Morton, De learned that aggressive spirit, surprise, and audacity could be as deadly as any torpedo. He learned that sometimes the safest place to be was inside the enemy's assumptions, doing the one thing they would never expect. By 1944, Day had his own command, the Gato-class submarine USS Harder. On his 5th war patrol, he was going to take everything he had learned and push it to the absolute limit. What he and his crew of 79 men did in a span of 4 days would stun the Imperial Japanese Navy reshape submarine tactics and quietly help set the stage for one of the most decisive carrier battles in history. The first act of that drama took place on April 13, 1944, near the island of Guam. Harder was on the hunt stalking a Japanese convoy. Somewhere out there, beyond the limits of the periscope lens, were merchantmen and troopers carrying fuel, ammunition, and men for the Japanese war machine. Somewhere out there was the payday that every skipper sought. But between the submarine and her prey steamed the convoy escort, the Japanese destroyer Akazuchi. Akazuchi spotted Harder first. The destroyer wheeled about and charged at flank speed, throwing a white bow wave as she came. In a matter of minutes, Harder would be under her guns and sonar. Every man in Harder's conning tower knew what was supposed to happen next. The skipper was meant to give the order that had saved countless submarines and failed to save others. Dive, take her down, go deep and hope the destroyer could not get an accurate solution before you slipped out from under the sonar beam. Instead, Samuel Day looked at the onrushing destroyer and gave an order that felt like madness. Flank speed ahead. Make ready the bow tubes. He was not going to run. He was going to charge. What Day was about to attempt had been considered almost suicidal, even as a theory. It had a name whispered in wardrooms and classroom lectures, the down-the-throat shot. The idea was brutally simple. You line up on a destroyer that is coming straight for you. You fire your torpedoes directly into her face, and at the very last possible second, you dive as hard as you can and try to pass beneath her keel before she hits you or charges on you. If the torpedoes miss, the submarine is placed in the worst position imaginable, directly under a furious destroyer, with perfect range and bearing. If the dive is late, the destroyer's bow can literally slice the submarine open. At a range of roughly 900 yards, point-blank range in naval combat, Harder unleashed a spread of 4 torpedoes. The crew had seconds to wait, seconds to wonder if this was one risk too far. 2 torpedoes slammed into Akazuchi amidships. In moments, the destroyer erupted in a boiling fireball, snapped in 2, and disappeared beneath the surface in less than 5 minutes. Day brought Harder to the surface long enough to survey the wreckage and send a radio message that would become legendary across the Pacific submarine force. It was as spare and cold as a dagger. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer. With that single defiant act, Samuel proved something that many had considered impossible. A submarine could hunt the hunter and win. The report raced across the American submarine community, electrifying a force that had spent years running from destroyers. It also painted a bright crimson target on D in the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By the spring of 1944, Admiral Somu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was a man running out of options. The Japanese Empire was being squeezed. Carrier air power and submarines were steadily cutting its supply lines. Between January and May of that year alone, Japan had lost 23 destroyers. Some fell to submarines, others to carrier aircraft or surface ships, but every loss hurt in the same painful way. Destroyers were the sheepdogs of the fleet, the only vessels fast and agile enough to shield carriers and battleships from American submarines. Japan did not have the industrial capacity to replace them quickly. Each destroyed destroyer was a hole in the armor around their precious carriers. At the same time, Japanese naval doctrine still clung to an old dream, the idea of a single decisive battle in which the enemy fleet would be lured into a carefully prepared trap and destroyed in one shattering blow. The Japanese called it Kai Kessen. Toyoda planned to revive this dream as Operation Ago, a grand scheme to entice the anticipated American invasion fleet into the Philippine Sea and annihilate it. To make that plan possible, Toyoda needed to concentrate his remaining naval power. So he gathered the core of the Japanese fleet at a remote anchorage called Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu archipelago. It was the largest concentration of Japanese warships since the Battle of Midway. 4 battleships, including the immense super battleship Yamato, 9 aircraft carriers, 15 heavy and light cruisers, 28 irreplaceable destroyers. On paper, it looked like a coiled spring ready to snap forward and smash the American invasion. There was one problem. American codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii were listening. They knew the Japanese mobile fleet was gathering at Tawi-Tawi, and Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, knew exactly what that meant. That anchorage, ringed by reefs and deep channels crawling with patrol planes and escorts, was a hornet's nest. Any submarine sent into those waters would be swimming among thousands of men whose entire job was to hunt and kill submarines. Lockwood had to choose a commander who not only understood the risk, but who would lean into it, who would treat destroyers not as monsters to be feared, but as targets. He chose Samuel D. and USS Harder. The orders were deceptively simple. Penetrate the waters around Tawi-Tawi, patrol, report, attack any targets of opportunity. In other words, walk into the wolf's lair and start stealing meat. For 9 agonizing days, Harder prowled around Tawi-Tawi, like a shark circling a cage full of divers armed with harpoons. She slipped between patrol lines, watching the great ships swing at anchor, charting departure drills and anchorages, radioing back precious details to Lockwood and the American High Command. She was often only a few miles from the most heavily guarded warships in the Pacific, surrounded by escorts and air patrols, yet still unseen. Luck, however, is a finite resource in war. In the small hours of June the 6th, 1944, the same day that Allied soldiers were storming ashore in Normandy on the far side of the world, a Japanese patrol aircraft scanned the dark waters near Tawi-Tawi. Its crew noticed the faintest trace on the surface, the slim feather of wake left by a periscope slicing the sea. The alarm went up. Within an hour, 3 destroyers detached from the anchorage and turned toward the contact. Minazuki, Hayanami, Tanakaze. Their orders were stark and unambiguous. Find the American submarine. Kill it. At first light, Commander Day stood in Harder's conning tower eye pressed to the periscope. He watched 3 grey knives cutting toward him across the dawn sea. He was 37 years old. This was his 5th war patrol. He had already sunk a long list of enemy ships. Now 3 of the deadliest anti-submarine vessels in the Japanese Navy were bearing down on him at once. The textbook said that he should run dive to 400 feet and hope the sonar operators aboard those destroyers were clumsy or sleepy. The men around him knew the routine. They could almost feel the depth charges already. Day decided to throw the book away. He chose his first victim. Minazuki leading the trio, 50 tons of steel escort bristling with 4 5-inch guns. She zigzagged aggressively, weaving back and forth to spoil any torpedo solution, and her sonar was already probing the water ahead. D swung Harder's bow directly toward her. As the destroyer closed, range markers ticked down. 1,500 yards, 1,200, 1,100. The sonar pings striking Harder's hull turned into a frantic metallic, hammering a frantic clang that every man in the boat could feel in his bones. The destroyer knew the submarine was there. The question was whether it would arrive in time to kill. D waited until Minazuki committed to her charge, then gave the order. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. 3 Mark 18 electric torpedoes slid from Harder's bow, invisible beneath the waves, leaving no betraying wake. Day then ordered a hard dive to 300 feet. Harder pitched down at a steep 30-degree angle, men grabbing for handholds as the deck became a ramp. 40 seconds later, the sea above them erupted with the thunder of explosions. The blasts shook the submarine so violently that light fixtures shattered and cork insulation rained down. A third massive detonation actually lifted Harder's stern and slammed it back into the water like a toy. When De cautiously brought his boat back up to periscope depth, Minazuki was gone. In her place was a pillar of black smoke, floating debris, and an expanding slick of oil. The destroyer had been broken in half and sent spiraling to the bottom. The 2 remaining destroyers reacted with pure panic. Instead of closing on Harder's last known position, they turned away, racing off and dropping depth charges in seemingly random patterns. They were convinced they had blundered into a pack of American submarines, not one audacious attacker. To let them flee. Harder slipped back into the deep. The hunter had killed one of the wolves, and the wolves were suddenly afraid of the dark water around them. When Admiral Toyoda received word that yet another destroyer had vanished, sunk by the same submarine that had already humiliated him off Guam, he was no longer merely angry. He was shaken. Within hours, 6 more destroyers were detached from convoy escort duty and rushed toward the Tawi-Tawi area. Patrol aircraft were ordered to crisscross the sky in dense patterns, searching relentlessly. The entire anchorage shifted from a coiled spring waiting for an invasion to a nest of agitated hornets furious at a single intruder. Samuel Durr, for his part, spent the rest of June 6th playing a dangerous game of hide-and-seek. Whenever the drone of aircraft engines rolled overhead, Harder dove deep. Inside the pressure hull, the air grew thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and the ever-present tang of steel and oil. Men whispered, moved carefully, and waited. Above them, a vast fleet searched for the small steel tube that had just removed one of its eyes. By the early hours of June 7th, Harder needed to recharge her batteries. She surfaced under a sky smothered in clouds with no moon to betray her silhouette. It was nearly perfect submarine weather, black upon black. At about 3:30 in the morning, Harder's radar operator picked up a contact. Single ship, bearing off the starboard bow. Range roughly 8,000 yards and closing fast. Its speed, nearly 30 knots, told Day everything he needed to know. This was not a plodding freighter. This was another destroyer. It was Hayanami, one of the destroyers that had fled in panic after the destruction of Minazuki. Her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, had spent the night searching for the American submarine. He was exhausted. Shortly after 3 in the morning, he had finally received orders to break off and return to Tawi-Tawi. No one on his bridge expected an American submarine to be waiting for them, much less one that would choose to attack on the surface like a small, fast surface raider. He ordered flank speed. Harder's big diesel engines roared, pushing her toward 21 knots, an astonishing pace for a submarine. His plan was as audacious as it was simple. If he could close the distance fast enough, he might slip inside the radius where Hayanami's radar would give a clear picture. He wanted to behave like a Japanese patrol craft returning home something routine and harmless. For a time, the deception worked. Hayanami's radar operator picked up a small, fast contact and likely assumed exactly that one more friendly boat heading for the anchorage. Then the distance closed. 3,000 yards, 2,500. Details sharpened. Somewhere on Hayanami's bridge, a Japanese officer looked at the contact and realized the fatal truth. That was not a patrol boat. It was an American submarine charging in. Kuboki ordered flank speed and a hard turn intent on ramming Harder and crushing her beneath his bow. But Day was already in position. Standing on the open bridge periscope ready, he gave the firing order. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. 4 torpedoes raced toward Hayanami from a range of just over 2,000 yards. 2 slammed into her starboard side near the aft magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire stern was torn away. The destroyer rolled over nearly onto her side, propellers thrashing uselessly in air, then slid beneath the waves, stern first. Commander Kuboki and almost 150 of his men went down with her. Day immediately ordered a crash dive. Patrol aircraft would certainly be overhead within minutes. Harder had now sunk 2 Japanese destroyers in less than a day right under the nose of the combined fleet. This was no longer just a tactical nuisance. It was a humiliation. For Admiral Toyoda, the loss of Hayanami piled crisis upon crisis. 2 destroyers had been ripped out of his defensive screen by the same submarine. His carefully gathered fleet was supposed to be protected by a ring of sharp fangs. Instead, that ring was being snapped off one tooth at a time. He reacted by stripping 8 more destroyers away from other duties, forming dedicated hunter-killer groups tasked with one mission only. Find the American submarine haunting Tawi Tawi. Destroy it at any cost. Every destroyer captain in the region received the same order. Maximum aggression. No retreat. Kill that submarine. A more cautious commander might have decided that he had already tempted fate enough. 2 destroyers sunk an entire fleet in uproar, dozens of destroyers and patrol aircraft combing the waters. It would have been perfectly reasonable to slip away and live to fight again. Samuel Day was not interested in being reasonable. He was interested in hunting. On June the 8th, he steered Harder south toward the Sabutu Passage, a narrow deep water channel between Tawi Tawi and Borneo. It was a crucial shipping lane and a logical patrol area for Japanese destroyers hunting submarines. Day did not avoid it. He went straight for it. Around mid-afternoon, Harder's lookout spotted smoke on the horizon. 2 ships. Through the periscope, Day identified one of them. Tanakaze, the 3rd destroyer from the original trio that had hunted him. The other vessel was an escort sweeping the strait at roughly 25 knots. Day took Harder down and began what submariners have always done best. He watched. For an hour and a half he tracked their movements carefully, noting their zigzag pattern. Every 8 minutes on schedule they altered course. It was routine, almost lazy, and it gave Day a narrow opening. After each turn there was a small window in which their course was predictable, their motion steady, and their vulnerability highest. He positioned Harder directly across their intended path and waited. At 4:30 in the afternoon, right on schedule, Tanakaze turned toward Harder's position. Range around 3,000 yards and closing. Dee watched the destroyer's bow fill more and more of the periscope view. 2,500 yards. 2,000. The moment approached when hesitation would turn opportunity into suicide. Dee ordered a spread. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. This time he spaced the launches 17 seconds between each torpedo, throwing out a wide net across Tanakaze's projected path. The first torpedo passed just ahead of her bow. The second struck near the bridge. The third tore into the forward magazine. The resulting explosion was beyond anything the crew of Harder had ever felt. Deep beneath the surface, they heard it as a crushing, grinding roar that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Tanakaze's bow was blown clean away from the rest of her hull. Both shattered pieces sank within roughly 3 minutes. The escort destroyer, seeing its partner vanish in a blossoming fireball, reacted with blind fury. It turned and charged the patch of sea where Harder had to be dropping depth charges in salvation-sized handfuls. Day took his submarine down to about 400 feet. Charges shook the hull and rattled men against steel, but they lacked the precise pattern needed for a kill. After 40 minutes, the escort abandoned the hunt and turned back to rescue survivors. 3 destroyers in 3 days. The news hit Admiral Toyoda like a physical blow. A single American submarine was dismantling his destroyer force at the very doorstep of his main anchorage. That boat, that one infuriating sliver of steel, now had a nickname whispered across Japanese decks: the Devil of Tawi Tawi. Toyoda stood on the brink of a decision that would ripple through the rest of the war. But Samuel Day was not finished yet. He had 1 more destroyer to send to the bottom, and this time he would do it under the eyes of 3 more. On June the 9th, just before dawn, Harder eased up to periscope depth, roughly a dozen miles southwest of Tawi Tawi. What Dee saw through the lens made every man in the conning tower hold his breath. Dead ahead, in a neat line abreast, steamed 4 Japanese destroyers. They were not simply travelling from one port to another. Their sonar pings beat steadily through the water, loud enough that Harder's sound operator could hear them without headphones. This was a hunter-killer group, and their prey was Harder. Dee checked his torpedo load. 8 remaining, 4 enemy destroyers. In practical terms, he would probably get 1 solid attack before all 4 converged on his last known position and turned the water into a blender of depth charges. He studied their movement. The lead destroyer zigzagged aggressively. The 3rd and 4th ships were also weaving, changing speed and heading, trying to make themselves bad torpedo targets. The 2nd destroyer, for reasons known only to her captain, held a steadier, more predictable course, demarked her as the target. At a little after 6 in the morning, the 2nd destroyer performed a routine turn that happened to carry her directly toward Harder. It was just another maneuver in her search pattern, but it sealed her fate. Range roughly 4,000 yards. Day waited as she came. 3,000, 2,500. The sonar pings grew deafening, hammering at the hull with every sweep. At 1,800 yards, Day made his call. Fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. He did not use his customary 4 torpedoes. He had to conserve what remained. It did not matter. All 3 struck home on the destroyer's port side within a handful of seconds. The result was nothing short of annihilation. The destroyer did not simply sink. She disintegrated. The explosion hurled chunks of deck sections of gun mountings and ragged slabs of superstructure 300 feet into the air. The ship rolled over and disappeared in about a minute and a half. The other 3 destroyers saw it all. They responded with pure incandescent rage. Every bow swung toward Harder's estimated position. De roared for an emergency dive to 500 feet. Harder nosed over crew bracing themselves against the sloping deck as she plunged. Depth charges began erupting overhead even as she descended. Within the first 10 minutes, 23 charges detonated around the submarine. The blasts were bone-jarring. The lights failed and the dim red glow of emergency lamps flickered on. The hull creaked and groaned under the pressure, a sound submariners called the bends as steel plates flexed and popped. In the forward torpedo room, a pipe burst, spraying high-pressure seawater across the deck. The crew moved through the dim red-lit chaos like veterans. No one screamed. No one panicked. Men crawled to valves, patched leaks, wiped oil from instruments, while above them 3 destroyers crossed and recrossed the area, sowing the sea with explosives. For 2 hours the barrage continued. But Day was as skilled at evasion as he was at attack. He kept Harder deep and slow, anticipating the patterns, refusing to give the enemy a clear target. Eventually, the destroyer captains came to the same conclusion. No submarine could possibly survive such a pounding. They assumed the Devil of Tawi Tawi had finally been exercised and broke off the hunt. When Harder cautiously climbed back to periscope depth, the sea above was empty. Day had sunk 4 destroyers in 4 days. He was not thinking about the tally. He was staring at his fuel gauges. Harder had burned through most of her diesel reserves. She had only a handful of torpedoes left. She could stay on station only a few more days before she would have no choice but to break off and head for base. While Day studied fuel levels and plotted his next patrol track, The news of that fourth destroyer sinking reached the flagship of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese mobile fleet still anchored at Tawi. Ozawa did the cold calculation. 4 destroyers sunk in 4 days by one American submarine operating just outside his main anchorage. If a single submarine could infiltrate his defensive ring, sink his best escorts almost at will, and then vanish into the deep, what chance did he have of protecting his carriers and battleships if he stayed in that harbour? Tawi was not a fortress. It was a trap. For him, Ozawa sent an urgent message to Admiral Toyoda. The fleet had to leave Tawi at once. The Americans knew where they were. Remaining there meant inviting more submarines, more harders, more invisible knives in the dark. Toyoda agreed. Operation A-Go had called for the fleet to remain at anchor until the Americans committed fully to the invasion, then sail on a carefully chosen date in mid-June to intercept them. That plan died the moment Harder sent that 4th destroyer to the bottom. On the morning of June the 10th, the Japanese mobile fleet weighed anchor in haste. 4 battleships, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, and the remaining 24 destroyers churned northeast 6 days ahead of schedule, scattered and disorganized, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. American codebreakers intercepted the movement orders within hours. Admiral Raymond Spruance, in command of the American Fifth Fleet, now knew not only roughly where Ozawa was going, but also that the Japanese had tipped their hand early. He had additional days to prepare his own carriers and submarines for the coming meeting in the Philippine Sea. Samuel Day knew nothing of this grand strategic picture. He was still in the Sabutu Passage, still hunting. Later that same day, Harder headed once again into the narrows of Sabutu. Around late afternoon, Day's lookouts spotted 2 more destroyers on patrol. Harder had 5 torpedoes left, enough for one more meaningful attack. At about 5:15 in the evening, Day fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at the lead destroyer. One struck the bow, ripping it open and bringing the ship to a stop, but failing to sink her outright. The second destroyer saw the hit and instantly charged Harder's position at more than 30 knots. Day ordered his last 2 torpedoes fired. Fire 4, fire 5, both missed. For the first time in this patrol, Harder faced the nightmare that had haunted submariners since the first undersea boats went to war. No torpedoes, a hostile destroyer bearing down at full speed, no way to strike back. Only the pressure of the deep and the unforgiving mathematics of depth and blast radius. Day ordered an emergency dive to 500 feet. Harder's diving planes bit hard. The deck tilted sharply. Men grabbed for pipes and handrails. 300 feet, 400, 500. The roar of the destroyer's propellers passed overhead, a rhythmic thumping that echoed through the hull like a heartbeat. Then the depth charges came. The first pattern of 6 detonated around Harder in a tight ring, rocking the submarine 15 degrees to starboard. Glass gauges shattered. Men slammed against bulkheads. 2 minutes later, a second perfect pattern exploded even closer, lifting the stern and dropping it like a hammer blow. In the control room, a hydraulic line burst, misting the air with oil. For an hour and a half, the destroyer hunted them, dropping a total of 42 depth charges. Most exploded too shallow or too deep. 3 came close enough to crack instruments and spring minor leaks. Day kept Harder as deep as she could, safely go moving at an almost painfully slow 2 knots, making as little noise as possible. Finally, as evening darkened, the destroyer broke off the hunt. Its depth charge racks were empty. Day waited another hour in the crushing silence before risking the surface. When Harder broke into the cool night air, the ocean around her was empty. She was bruised, dented, and weary. She had no torpedoes and little fuel. The patrol was finished. Harder turned south for Fremantle, Australia, and home. On June the 26th, 1944, Harder slid into Fremantle Harbour. Tied up to the pier, she carried scars on her hull and a story that would be told and retold for generations. Admiral Lockwood was waiting on the dock. He had been following Day's terse radio reports with mounting awe. 5 destroyers attacked, 4 confirmed sunk, 1 heavily damaged. All achieved in roughly 12 days. It was and remains the most successful anti-destroyer patrol by any submarine in naval history. Lockwood did not wait for formal ceremonies. He came aboard Harder, and right there on her deck presented Samuel Day with the Navy Cross. Then, as crews swapped stories and lines were secured, he asked the question every submarine skipper both dreaded and expected after a brutal patrol. "Can you do it again?" Day did not hesitate. "Give me torpedoes and I will sink 10. For the next month, Harder and her crew remained in Fremantle, repairing damaged systems and resupplying. Day used the time to brief other submarine officers. He laid out his down-the-throat tactics in detail, explained how to read a destroyer's zigzag patterns, how to judge commitment when to fire and when to dive. By late July, nearly every submarine commander in the Pacific had studied his patrol reports. The effect was immediate. Between June and August, emboldened by D's example, American submarines sank 14 more Japanese destroyers, using variations of aggressive close-range attacks. The hunters were becoming the hunted. At almost the same time, the full strategic impact of Harder's 5th Patrol played out on the grand stage of the Philippine Sea. On June the 19th, just 9 days after, descent that 4th destroyer to the bottom and forced Ozawa's fleet out of Tawi-Tawi. Early the Battle of the Philippine Sea erupted. Because the Japanese had left in haste, their entire operation was unbalanced. Their carriers arrived in scattered groups. Their reconnaissance aircraft had burned much of their fuel simply trying to locate the enemy, often failing. Their destroyers were still reorganizing. Their supply ships were days behind schedule. When American carrier pilots finally found Ozawa's fleet, they faced disorganized understrength air patrols and crews with less training than the veterans lost earlier in the war. The result was a slaughter in the skies. American pilots shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft while losing only a few dozen of their own. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Imperial Navy lost roughly 3/4 of its remaining carrier air groups in 2 days, a wound it would never recover from. American submarines added to the disaster. Boats like Kavala and Albacore sent 2 of Ozawa's largest carriers, Shokaku and Taiho, to the bottom. American carrier aircraft sank another carrier, Hio. When the smoke cleared, the once fearsome Japanese carrier force was a hollow shell. In his post-war reflections, Admiral Lockwood would call Harder's 5th Patrol the single most strategically important submarine operation in the entire Pacific War. A single submarine, by sinking destroyers and frightening a fleet out of its anchorage ahead of schedule, had helped set the conditions for a decisive carrier victory. Harder herself and the man who commanded her still had 1 patrol left. On August the 5th, 1944, fully repaired and rearmed, Harder departed Fremantle for her 6th war patrol. This time she was part of a 3-boat wolf pack along with USS Hado and USS Hake. Day, now a legend among submariners, served as senior officer of the group. Their mission was straightforward: patrol the waters west of Luzon in the Philippines and shred Japanese shipping. They started brilliantly. On August the 21st, the Wolfpack intercepted and sank 4 large cargo ships. On the following day, Harder and Hado attacked a group of coastal defense vessels, sinking 3. Harder was credited with 2 frigate-sized ships, Matsuwa and Hiburi. By the 23rd, Hado had used all her torpedoes and withdrew, leaving Harder and Hake hunting together off Dassault Bay. The Japanese, however, were learning as well. Their intelligence services had monitored radio traffic and convoy losses. They knew there were American submarines operating off Luzon, and this time they sent something more specialized than standard destroyers. Escort ships and minesweepers designed and trained specifically for anti-submarine warfare. Just before dawn on August the 24th, Hake was submerged a few miles off the coast. Through her periscope, her captain could see Harder on the surface, several thousand yards to the south. The 2 submarines were coordinating an attack on a Japanese target. Suddenly, Hake's sonar operator heard the one sound that made the blood of any submariner run cold, a clear, sharp echo ranging ping close and getting closer. 2 Japanese escort vessels, CD-22 and the minesweeper PB-102, were closing fast on Harder's position at about 18 knots. They were actively hunting. Hake's captain ordered his own boat down deep and silent. Through the periscope, he watched the escorts loom nearer to Harder. His radio operator tried desperately to warn Day, but received no response. At about 5:30 in the morning, Harder finally spotted the oncoming escorts and crash-dived. but the range was already dangerously short, less than 2,000 yards. In the haste of the dive, her diesel engines were still running as she slipped below the surface, leaving a trail of churning bubbles that pointed directly to her like a giant arrow. The sonar operator aboard CD-22 could not have asked for a better target. He had a clear, strong contact with an accurate estimate of Harder's depth and course. The escorts closed in. De drove Harder down at a steep angle, but he could not outrun physics. Shortly before 6 in the morning, CD-22 made the first depth charge run. A full pattern of charges set to explode at around 250 feet dropped neatly around Harder. Several detonated within 50 feet of her hull. The blast wave does not need a direct hit to be lethal. Pressure tore at Harder's steel. Her pressure hull cracked near the after torpedo room. Seawater poured in with incredible force. In barely more than a minute, the stern compartments flooded completely. Harder's bow shot upward as the stern dragged her down. In the control room, Day would have been shouting for emergency ballast blow, ordering every possible counter-flooding measure to fight the weight of incoming water. Compressed air roared into ballast tanks. Pumps struggled. It was not enough. Minutes later, CD-22 made a second pass. This time the charges exploded even closer. The main pressure hull failed in several locations. The control room flooded. All electrical power died. Deep below her designed operating depth, somewhere around 600 feet, Harder's hull could no longer withstand the crushing grip of the sea. Bulkheads buckled. Compartments collapsed. The submarine imploded. On the surface, the Japanese escorts observed a spreading patch of oil, floating debris, and pieces of cork insulation rising to the waves. They circled for hours, dropping additional charges to ensure there would be no escape. They recovered no survivors. All 79 men of USS Harder were gone. The destroyer killer had been killed by the very kind of escorts he had spent his career defying. When news of Harder's loss reached Admiral Lockwood, it hit the submarine force like a hammer. He immediately suspended operations in the area. For the Japanese, the victory was a rare moment of relief. Admiral Toyoda received the report on August the 26th. The devil of Tawi Tawi was finally dead. Toyoda ordered a commendation for the crew of CD-22. What he could not erase was the legacy Harder left behind. Before Harder's fifth patrol, the unwritten rule of submarine warfare still held sway. When a destroyer found you, you ran. You dove as deep as your boat allowed and prayed. After Harder's patrol, that equation changed. Submarine commanders armed with D's reports and the proof of his success began to see destroyers not as untouchable predators, but as targets that could be killed with aggression, timing, and courage. By the end of the war, American submarines, many of them using tactics inspired by D's down-the-throat attacks, had sunk more than 200 Japanese warships. Among them were 4 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 9 cruisers, and 38 destroyers. Samuel Day's legacy was written across the Pacific seabed in twisted steel and shattered hulls. On March the 27th, 1946, that legacy received its highest official recognition. On the lawn of the White House, President Harry Truman presented Commander Samuel D's Medal of Honor to his widow Edwina. The citation spoke of 5 vital destroyers, sunk in 5 close-range attacks of indomitable fighting spirit and fearless leadership. The Navy named a destroyer escort USS Samuel B. D. Harder herself received the Presidential Unit citation. Her unofficial motto, "Hit him harder," became part of submarine lore. At the United States, Naval Academy instructors still tell the story of Harder's patrols and demonstrate the down-the-throat attack. Modern submarines armed with long-range guided torpedoes and missiles would rarely, if ever, use such a tactic. The lesson now is not about specific angles and ranges. It is about mindset. When your enemy expects you to run, charging may be the one move they cannot easily counter. The 79 men who served aboard Harder came from 38 different American states. They were farm boys from the plains of Iowa, factory workers from the industrial towns of Michigan, college graduates from California, and young men from cities and small towns across the nation. They volunteered for the silent service, knowing that the risks were immense. Roughly 22% of all American submariners who served in the Second World War died, the highest casualty rate of any branch of the United States military. They knew this. they signed up anyway. For many years after the war, one man remained to bear first-hand witness to Harder's story. Paul Bryce, the last surviving member of her crew, lived on into the 21st century. When he passed away in the year 2022 at the age of 98, the last living voice of USS Harder fell silent. That is why stories like this matter. Official patrol reports tell us tonnage, sunk coordinates, times of attack. They record the cold facts. They do not capture what it felt like to stand in a dim, red-lit control room and hear depth charges march closer, or to trust your life to the calm voice of a man at a periscope who decides to charge a destroyer instead of running away. They do not capture the hands shaking on a valve that must hold, or the way a crew breathes out together when the sonar pings finally fade. Those parts of the story survive only if we choose to remember them. If this journey with USS Harder and Commander Samuel moved you, if you want more untold stories of courage, sacrifice, and daring that shaped the Second World War in ways both small and immense, then you are warmly invited to subscribe to WW2 Untold Battles. By doing so, you become part of a community that refuses to let men like Durr and his 79 shipmates slip quietly into the dark without a trace. Their story has already been written in steel and seawater. Together, we can make sure it is never forgotten.